What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Ryon McDermott, and with me
is Dr. Kipp Pietrantonio.
All right, this is the Psychology Men Show, and we are going to be talking today about running men's groups. So I'm very excited. This is something that I used to love to do. I haven't done it in a little while, but it's near and dear to my heart. And Dr. Kipp here is, I would consider to be quite a bit of an expert on this. Was actually featured in the Wallstreet Journal at one point.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get a link up there for that. And take it away. What do you want to tell us about men's groups, Kipp?
Yeah, so I think one thing about men's groups is now let's be clear what we're talking about when we say men's groups. So this is like some colloquial terms we're using. What we mean by that is running group therapy with exclusively men in the group. Okay?
Right.
So the important factor there is the dynamic changes, because this is something you're basically asking men to get together in a group, be vulnerable, talk about their feelings, talk about their emotions, talk about mental health, which is something that is very the antithesis of what is being masculine, yet is very healthy. So
right. It is the antithesis, though. It seems like it wouldn't really work. So why doesn't it? Why doesn't it work at times?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Generally, I would say that the number one reason that it works, and Ryan, and you'll have to jump in and tell me what you think about this, is to do with therapist error, in my opinion. So I would say that the number one reason it doesn't work is because people try to make the traditional form of group therapy work for an all men's group. So when people picture therapy groups, what they picture is like, a bald guy wearing a nice sweater, like sitting in a circle, and a bunch of guys, and it's like, they're passing around the feeling stick that you can talk, right? And
I have seen the talking stick. I've seen that happen.
Right. And what it does is, like, if you're a young guy, that is the antithesis of what you want to do. Now, what I'm not saying is that no guys could benefit from that kind of environment. They absolutely can. But what you're going to do is you're going to segment out the guys who are already the guys who do well in those groups probably actually, ironically, don't need those groups.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. When I think of group therapy, I think of interpersonal process groups, which is probably something a lot of our listeners and viewers have not heard of. But it's basically just like learning how to connect with each other and learning that whatever problems we're dealing with are universal to each other, right? So it's the group is demonstrating that. I'm wondering, what, like, that seems like it should be a good thing for guys in some ways, because so many guys feel isolated and such. So, like, I'm still trying to figure out, like, how getting groups of guys together, and even if you were to try to make some kind of, kitschy talking thing, how that wouldn't be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what it can be is it can be really damaging is if you put the guys together and they have a poor experience, because it turns them off to group therapy when in actuality they could really, really benefit from it. Or even worse, it can turn them off from mental health completely.
Oh, wow.
Which is really scary when we think about our men's suicide rates, being 4 times the size of women's suicide rates here in our country. So, it's like, I used to think about that when I would have a guy come in for the very first time. I would be thinking, like, this is this guy's very first exposure. It kind of goes like, for those who like comic books, Stan Lee has this statement about comic books that every comic book is somebody's first comic book.
Oh.
So you have to write your comic book like that. So when I'm seeing a new guy come in to the group for the very first time, I'm thinking this is his very first exposure to mental health. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times. And it's my job to make sure he has a good experience, because that could potentially save that person's life down the line later on.
Right,
so I take it very seriously. The other thing I would say, just going back to like kind of the problems, is that people often think if they can crowbar masculinity out of the way and get to the gooey feelings that are underneath, that way then you can like be successful. So masculinity, rather than being a cultural variable that we have to work with, instead becomes an obstacle. And even in worse forms, I'll see people talking about deconstructing toxic masculinity in a group, which is even worse, because what you're saying then is that it's incredibly important to like take apart masculinity into these like reductionist and help the person realize their privilege, or realize, when in actuality that like there isn't, when a guy is entering a therapy group, he is in a completely vulnerable, completely weakened, completely like, I'm coming here for help state, and then to tell that person that they're like privileged and they need to like take apart that privilege in order to get healthy, like that is so the antithesis of what that person is going through in that moment. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't take apart toxic masculinity. That is something that I think naturally happens in the group.
Right.
But
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Say what you're going to say.
That there's a lot of, I think, conceptual stuff that's happening in a group therapy experience that we're not really talking about explicitly. You know, like we wouldn't say like, oh, good for you. You just expressed your feelings, and men are not supposed to express their feelings. So what's that like to express your feelings in here? We wouldn't say. But when somebody does express their feelings, we might say like, wow, that was really real. You know,
yeah,
wow.
really powerful or something like that, right? So you don't have to be so explicit about it, because what you're going to do is, again, you're going to turn the guy off, or the crowd that stays with the group is going to be the people who don't need it.
That's fast. I hadn't even thought about that last part.
Yeah. So for example, when I was working at Ohio State and I was running men's groups at the time, we would get a reasonable amount of guys who would just naturally come in, like they would want to do a men's group, right? And these tended to be guys who were already fantastic, like they had been in mental health services for a long time. But what I wanted the fraternity guys, or I wanted the athletes. I wanted the guys who would never, ever come to that group typically, because it goes against who they naturally are, because those are the guys who actually need that kind of a group.
Right. Well, that actually sounds like the men's group I did run when I was on internship. All the guys there had some pretty significant, interpersonal issues, and most of them were from fraternities.
Yeah. And, because if we're going to talk about toxic masculinity, they're the ones who are immersed the most in it. Now, I'm not trying to stereotype fraternity guys or anything, but it's just there's a higher prevalence, in the same way that there's a higher level of eating disorders among sorority sisters, right?
Right.
It just is a thing that exists, right, in that culture, because there's more pressure to adhere.
I would say I think it's moderated by the kind of fraternity you're in. I mean, sometimes fraternities can be like amazing brotherhood experiences, including in those places that might have some of that toxic masculinity stuff going on. I think personally, I think it's a mixed bag, but I'm glad that you're getting guys who are not wanting to come to therapy in your group, because it hadn't occurred to me, but sure enough, we did have one or two people come in and ask if we had a men's group. And at the time, we ended up not screening them in because we just didn't have room. It already was a closed group. But I wonder what would have happened if we brought those folks in with these guys who were like, in many ways, trying to struggle to connect with each other. And when I think about interpersonal process, the whole goal is to connect with each other in like a laboratory environment where you can kind of say, hey, I'm worried that I come across this way. Do I come across this way? Or like, hey, my problem revolves around my inability to connect with people, and I feel like I'm not good enough, and that kind of thing. And learning that somebody else has that same thing for you can be really powerful. But if someone comes in that's like at a higher level with all that stuff, it's almost like you're putting an outlier into a data set. It doesn't seem all that smart.
Right. So just to lay out kind of a part of what I would say is maybe a little bit of a difference between me and Dr. McDermott's approach here, just a little bit, is I never ran like an interpersonal process group, which is a group that's very much designed toward, like, within the concept of group therapy, we kind of have, when we were taught in school, you're taught there's like these different types. There's like a structured group, there's a support group, and then there's an interpersonal group, right? But I actually really, when you're working with men, I actually rejected those like separations, and actually caught a lot of flack. Almost everywhere I've ever run men's groups, I've caught flack for that, because people really want you to categorize what kind of group you have.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I just assumed it was an interpersonal process group from the way you've talked about it, but I'm curious to hear more.
So I would say it's about 70% support group, 30% interpersonal process. And the difference between that is because I have found that when you give guys lots of interpersonal feedback, that they quit the group.
Right.
Right. And if you give interpersonal feedback rarely, but at really important pinnacle times in the group, then that could be incredibly valuable. But I think if you're constantly trying to process that every 5 seconds, what guys do is they start getting frustrated. My guys would actually call them moments. They would call it, they would love it. They would be like, oh, it's when we have metagroup, where we have group where we talk about group. And they would always call it metagroups. And then it would be so funny because at the end of the semester, a lot of times they would be like, oh, we should have more metagroups. Metagroups are really cool.
So metagroup is when they would recognize the underlying like process and content that's happening in the. Am I right about that?
Right. And what I would do is I would employ those like, process comments and those kind of like moments at very important, like what I would call like turning points in the group when we're going from like, when we're going from like the storming phase to the next phase, the different phases of group. It's really important you hit that note at the exact right time, because when I've seen therapists who go right after that process right away, they scare guys off.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we might be doing the same thing to a certain extent, just not like. So when my colleague and I, who was actually my supervisor, who and I ran this group at Missouri, basically we had a whole bunch of like humor and small talk and stuff that went on for like at least a week or two. I mean, like full on, and then slowly the process comments started to come in, and sort of towards by the end of the semester, we were just doing a whole bunch of this metagroup stuff. But it was very different. I hope we do get to talk about this. It was very different than the groups I ran with both men and women.
Yeah,
it was a very different feeling to it.
Yeah, and the reason is because you were trying, and tell me what you think about this, Ryan. But you were trying to introduce some normal guy stuff, into the group, which a lot of people are really afraid of doing. Right? They're really afraid. Like if we're talking about football, we're not doing good work. If we're talking about pro wrestling, we're like goofing around. The goofing around is not what we're here to do. And there's almost this fear that like the guys are going to become dissatisfied or something like that. But in actuality, that is the relationship building. And actually, I think if you do that part well, that will actually pay off tenfold down the line. And I think most, when I talk to guys who have been doing this work for a while, when I talk to other psychologists, social workers, counselors, marriage and family therapists, whoever, that everybody comes to that realization eventually. And it shows up in different ways. Like I've heard men's groups run where they play poker the whole time. I've heard men's groups run where they like play video games the whole time. I've heard men's groups where they go out and play basketball. Like, it's like everybody kind of figures out that piece of the puzzle eventually. When you've been doing the work long enough.
About this, we should do a follow-up episode, and I can bring in Fred Rabinowitz, who's been doing a men's group for like 30 some years, and sometimes with the same people. And I think that what you're saying, he would agree with wholeheartedly, because really, for some guys, this is their form of personal connection. It's not necessarily about therapy. It's therapy is trying to change somebody, but that's the difference between something that is therapeutic. So like I think what you're doing is therapeutic, but not necessarily therapy all the time, like therapy trying to change somebody. It's that you're setting the conditions for. It's like a dose effect, right? The more you get of these good conditions, and you connect with other guys, you're dismantling some masculinity things, but you're never making it explicit.
Right. Yeah, and so what the other piece I would say that's really important with that is that it's not just like the number one intervention that I use with guys is saying something positive to them. Like I tell guys that they're hardworking. I tell guys that I'm proud of them. I tell guys that I care about them. I tell guys that sucks and like that problem they went through is terrible and it's awful, right? I give them validation and positive regard, and that is 9/10 of the battle, because in my opinion, men in this generation basically never hear that unless it's in the context of making some kind of achievement. So when a guy's like, hey, I really struggled and I ended up getting a C in this class, and I tell that person, hey, I'm really proud of you. You worked really hard throughout the semester, and who cares what you got? Like, that is so foreign to this group, this generation of people. And I would say even going back to Gen X, because I've had older guys in the group too, that same concept. It's just they get no positive regard unless you achieve something. And I would say it's the equivalent of women, unless you're pretty, it's like being pretty and being attractive is like a prerequisite for all other success a lot of times, right?
Interesting. Yeah,
I'm not saying I believe that. What I'm saying is that like women often feel that way. Unless they have that box checked, they can't be successful in every other domain of their life, right?
Right.
And so it's the same kind of thing.
Let me ask you this, Kipp. When a guy says, "Hey, I'm really struggling with this grade, but I managed to eke it out with a C, or I'm really disappointed in myself," walk us through what the group would do.
Mm-hmm.
Like so you just said, what you would do. What would the group do?
So the first thing I would hope is it depends on how well established the group is at that time. So if it's at the beginning of group, it's going to be really heavy. I'm going to be more heavy-handedly pushing the process to happen, right? So I might say something like, "Has anybody else ever done that? Anybody else ever struggled in a class? Has anybody else taken that class? Like, who teaches that class? Is he an asshole?" You know, like something like,
some amount of humor, it sounds like, in there.
Right, or something going on. And then hopefully somebody else will be like, "Yeah, I took that class," or "I did that," or "I did this." And then what I'll hope is that a couple other guys will jump in. And then if I've done a good job modeling the whole, like, "I'm proud of you, who cares, like, I still think you're a great person, regardless of how you did in the class," what I'm hoping is one of my guys that I've deemed to be a leader in the group, which are usually my veteran guys, will jump in. And sometimes I can make that happen by just giving one of my guys who I know had a similar experience a look.
Yeah. That's great. So your group, it sounds like you've got rotating members coming in and out. That is very different than what we had. But I have run groups where at least been part of groups where we've had rotating members, and I can see what you're talking about.
Across the semesters. So same guys for 15 weeks. And then guys who stick around, and then some guys will drop out because they'll be done, and then other guys will join in.
So maybe help our readers understand, and this I think is part of selling groups. I'm a big believer in groups, but I want to hear it from you as well. Mm-hmm. Why does this work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first thing is I approach the entire situation from a pro-masculinity standpoint, or a positive I guess I would say a positive masculinity standpoint. Yeah. And that starts from, I do a group screening with every single guy, so I meet and I talk to the guy beforehand, and that from the moment I go out and say the person, let's say his name's John, right? From the moment I go out and get John, I'm already doing that. So I'm not like, when I go out to get him from the waiting room, I'm not like, "Jonathan? Is Jonathan here?" Right? I walk out and I'm like, "John, hey, what's up, man? How you doing? I'm Kipp. Like, you want to come on back? How you doing today? What'd you do this weekend? Did you go to the game?" Right? And I'm already starting that regular guy dialogue with him, and I'm not doing it in a frou-frou kind of soft and sensitive way or a phony way. I'm being as genuine as I possibly can be from the moment it starts. Right. And then when you carry that and you carry it into the group, the guy gets fired up because he's like, "Oh, cool, this is a cool guy. I'm getting along with him. My office is decorated, or it used to be at least, decorated in a very masculine, friendly way. It's not hyper masculine, but I have a blend of more therapy stuff and then more masculine stuff everywhere. And then from there, go ahead.
Pause for a second. You said something I was hoping you would kind of give me an opening to ask you about.
Yeah.
You said it's not hyper masculine. So I'm wondering, a common question I get about men's groups is, what do you do if guys start going too far? If they start getting into this kind of hypermasculine, let's say, what if sexism comes into the group? How do you handle that?
So I think so I think that this is one of those traps I think novice therapists fall into, right? So when a moment comes up where somebody says something sexist, there can be this instinct to be like, "I'm going to kill that right off the bat," or "I'm going to challenge this person immediately in the group," right? And I think that that's a mistake, because what it does is you don't let the process, first of all, play itself out. Right. Which is a really important thing to let happen, and something I have to, when I would train my trainees on, I would, because they're so social justice oriented as new therapists, that they're like, "Oh my God, sexism, I gotta kill it," right? And it's hold on, let the group see if they can do it first.
Right. And it's going to be more powerful for sure, right?
It's going to be more powerful, and then you get to act in a supportive mediating role, which is you're going to be much more effective in creating the change you want in the group from that position than you are directly directly challenging, because what it's going to turn into is you versus that individual group member.
That's right. That's right. Which
Or everybody's going to pile on that group member, and then they're going to quit.
Of course. And I think I'll tell a story that I think illustrates what you're saying really, really well, but tell me if this is kind of what you're thinking of. This is from a young man in our group who basically said something very sexist. I will not repeat what he said here, but the group got quiet for a minute. This is probably around like the fifth or sixth session of the semester. The group got really, really quiet. And so all I said was, wow, it seems like something just happened there. We all got really quiet. That was my process comment. And then somebody stepped up and said, man, I hear you, but I don't believe that. And I just I got quiet for a minute because I haven't heard that kind of language in a long time. And after sort of everybody sharing and then me processing, what was it like to hear that? So I was playing the mediator exactly like you're saying.
Yep.
I wasn't delivering any feedback myself. At one point he said something that was just so powerful. He just said, I just want to say I apologize. I just wanted you guys to like me.
Yep.
Bingo. And that was a powerful moment. I'm not sure who came up with this terminology, but I really like it. It's the idea of when a guy lets down the mask, of masculinity, because it's kind of like this performance thing that we do. I think that that's an example of deconstructing masculine roles and some of that toxic stuff that we have learned about or talked about on this show, but without doing it explicitly and in a way that was affirming to the man, because he was able to really connect with that guy. Because then what I said was, well, sounds like you really want these guys to like you. What would it be like here and here if they like you? How would you know if they liked you? And he was able to then go further.
That's literally a perfect example, right? That's exactly using the skills versus if you had challenged him directly. Sure, right. It would have been good modeling for the group on how to challenge that kind of behavior, but it would have missed the actual process, which is like when guys conform to those kinds of things, like let's say they're calling somebody a racial slur, or they're calling somebody a sexist slur or homophobic slur or whatever kind of thing. It's driven by this piece of wanting to be liked or cared, or maybe it's driven by rebellion, right? Like they feel like they need to differentiate themselves from everybody in the group, which is also something to open up and talk about. And you can let the group do that work, and then you get to jump in. I've even found it where I've ended up almost defending that person to protect them a little bit, where I've almost been in the inside-out role on it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and not in I'm defending sexism or anything like that, but being hey guys, let's hear what was going on for him, because other people are starting to dogpile. You know what I mean? So you almost have to come back in, and then you end up being a support figure, which then sets up my favorite alley-oop of all time, which is then if you're the defender of the guy, later on, you pull him aside one-on-one after the group. And you have the real dialogue that you want to have with the person, but because you had their back in the group, they're so much more open to the feedback, versus what typically happens is somebody confronts the person in the group, and then you have to have this adversarial one-on-one conversation after group.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, okay, so I'm hearing a bunch of different things. I wonder if maybe for people who are going to be starting their own men's group or want to go down this avenue, what are some therapy styles, therapy skills, that could be really helpful for those people to keep in mind? Because I'm hearing a lot of different things from you, but I just want to hear from you as well.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just say two parts to that. One is how you structure the group, right? And then the second one is actually what the things you kind of say, which I already started touching on. So the first thing is, I think what I found is to be most effective is this structure. Not saying this is the best structure or anything, but first 15 minutes you completely dedicate to talking about whatever the guys are interested in. I called this time what's going on in the world time, but really what it is getting guys to talk about what they're interested in and getting them to connect about that. So, you're talking about Marvel movies, video games, you're talking about basketball, you're talking about memes, and where that becomes important, and this is where a lot of guys, therapists, get scared, is you have to gain competency in those things in order to talk about them, so you don't come off as an old fogey.
so okay, yeah, I've always felt like you were very much into pop culture. Is that part of your job, or was that part of your passions?
I think it's both, but I'm also, there's tons of stuff that guys are into that I'm not into,
Like what?
So for example, I don't know a single thing about coding, right?
What's that?
Like coding on a computer, coding.
Oh yeah, okay.
Right.
So
So,
like
but like,
engineer guys.
but tons of guys that I would have in my group like knew about coding, so I would have to go educate myself about like coding languages or like jokes about coding or just little goofy things like that. Or like, dude, like how about the Brown? Like when I was in Ohio, the Cleveland Browns history in football. Like I know nothing about the Cleveland Browns, right? I couldn't even name a single player on the Cleveland Browns when I moved to Ohio.
I don't think I can name like. Yeah, I get you.
Right, so you have to know about that stuff, or you have to know about the cities that they're from. Like, I had to know about Cleveland. I had to know about Cincinnati. I had to know what people are like from those cities, and, like, the suburbs that people are from, and be able to talk about that stuff. Or, like, what kind of clubs and organizations are popular in Ohio. Like, in Ohio, speech and debate is this thing, this club that tons of kids do in high school. It's, like, this huge competition thing in Ohio. But, like, I would have no idea about that, but I have to learn about that stuff.
So it basically just sounds like you're having to be culturally competent.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're constantly asking people like, this is a skill I used to teach the interns and stuff. It was like, don't ask the guys like, what is that? Like, go home, watch a YouTube video about it, and then come back and just jump in on the conversation. Like, don't make them educate you, which again is just cultural competence.
Cultural competence. Yeah, but it's funny when we think about it in terms of like race and like gender and ethnicity and those kind of things. But this is fascinating because it sounds like this is how you've learned how to connect with men to a certain extent.
Yeah, so Freud said there's like the royal road to the unconscious, is like dreams. For men's group, the royal road is through their interests. If you can like build that stuff, you're good. You're solid.
That's cool. So if I'm just to recap, I'm hearing that part of it is the structure, the first 15 minutes being about really connecting. Maybe that's the support group format for a little bit. And then what happens after that?
So then you'll do your check-in, And one thing that I really make important is for the first like 6 or 7 weeks, I will make everybody go through their names, right? Because I refuse to have anybody not know somebody's name in the group.
Right.
Right, and that's really, really important because what happens is people who talk a lot, their names get known, and people who are quiet, their names don't get known. And that's one of the ways that like dominators in a group start to emerge, right? So by making everybody know each other's names, there's this egalitarian thing. So I'll do that ad nauseum, right?
Interesting.
To the point of absurdity. But then I'll almost where it's a joke. You know what I mean? Let's just do it one more time, just for fun, just one more, Anyway, so we'll do that. We'll do check-ins, and then
how does that last typically? Check-in. Like, how long does each person get to speak? Is there a structure to it?
Yeah, I usually try to keep everybody under 30 seconds or so, and the check-in is designed just to be like, hey, what topic do you want time today?
Nice. Okay.
So people claim time, and then I would go around, and most of the time, more than 2 or 3 people want time, so we end up having to talk about themes.
Yeah.
So if you're, let's say the theme of somebody's afraid about applying for a job, somebody's having relationship difficulties. Another person is went through a breakup, right? Another person's like having trouble with school, right? So the 2 themes there might be relationships and achievement. Right, and so we'll tie those kinds of things together, and that'll be the 2 topics that we talk about for the group.
Makes sense. Makes total sense.
So, but anyway, then we'll do counseling for an hour, which is mainly at the beginning of counseling is a lot of modeling and showcasing and getting people to talk, and then later on in counseling is a lot more sitting back and delivering those big interventions. And I don't know, Ryan, what's your opinion on self-disclosure in those kinds of groups?
You mean it from the therapist?
Yep.
I mean, because obviously clients have to self-disclose.
Yeah.
I did it quite a bit, but I tend to use it quite a bit in my therapy anyway, just because, working with college students, and like one example I use is when somebody's sharing something that's like, it's not my experience. So like I'm trying to set the stage for other people like to not have that experience as well, or at least to voice that it's not their experience. So I'll first ask the group, who else identifies with that? Or maybe someone has had a different experience, something like that. Mm-hmm. And if nobody goes for the difference one, I'll say like, that was a little different than my experience. And I'll just kind of share that and see what they think about it. I think it's a fine line between you want to be a part of the group, but you don't want to be a member in the group. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
And you don't want to be the center of attention either, which is like can be a really big thing. But what I would usually do is if I was going to do a self-disclosure, I would do it as my very last thing at the end of the group.
right. That's powerful. Like sort of like a reflection.
Yeah, and then, you've done all this work already, and then you're like, it's almost like this kind of wise man thing or something at the end where you're like, let me tell you guys, I've been through this too.
Right.
Right. And then you're not taking space from anybody else because you're doing it at the very, very end, like, during the last, like, 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's smart. Yeah, that's very smart.
And usually the guys really like that. And then it also doesn't give them any opportunity to ask any follow-up questions about it. So then you don't have to disclose more than you want to,
Leave it's door hanger, right? So
yeah, you're like, okay, and that's it. That's as much as I'm going to talk about. But and then the end of the group, we would always play a game. And the games had 2 types. So in one version of the game, you would do cooperate. So it would be a cooperative goal, like trying to get a high score on like a game of some kind. Or they would be competitive, where you'd have half the group competing against the other half of the group.
So your typical session is an hour and a half, am I right?
Yep.
And how long is that game going?
10 minutes.
Okay. Were these like things that you had on your phone, or like what was it exactly?
All kinds of things. So I had a repertoire of about 10 to 15 games that I could pull out. And we would rotate through them. Well, maybe not 10 to 15, maybe like 7. We would rotate through them once, and then the guys would pick kind of from there.
Right.
So games we would play is like catchphrase, because that's really quick, and you're trying to work toward a high score. So we would see how many we could get as a group as you're passing it around. One of the competitive games we would do is spoons. Where everybody's like trying to grab for the spoon, and I would play like intense metal music in the background. And so the guys were like, and it would like, and I would have it like be all like balls to the wall kind of thing, where guys would be like diving for spoons and wrestling for spoons, and it's that kind of competitive brotherly play that people did, and they really liked it, right? And then, and the other guys would always stick around and watch it and everything. Sometimes I would bring in video games, and we would play video games. Like there's some games that you can play that have like 8 players, which is pretty cool. We would do this game called, like, we called it Doctor, but it had like a better name. But it was basically like one person would leave the group, come back, and everybody in the group would be pretending to be a character.
Wow.
And so you'd, like, let's say everybody was Donald Trump. They would say Trump-like things, and then the doctor, the detective, would have to ask questions to figure out who we were all being.
Yeah.
And so that was like a really
fun,
yeah, it was a lot of fun. So we would do that, every single week, and the guys would really like it. And what the trick is at the beginning, the guys are really hardcore about the game and like wanting to play it. But as time goes on, they care less and less and less, and actually the game almost becomes like a nuisance, right? Where they're like, oh, we don't want to stop talking and play the game. But they could never realize that the game helped them build the rapport that got them there. Plus, the game has the benefit of, as they leave, they're in a really good mood and they're talking.
Right.
Which builds the camaraderie on the way out the door.
So how did you handle what's the word? Intergroup. I mean, within the group fraternization outside of the like friends and stuff.
I never really had major issues with it. I mean, I would address it and just say like, hey, I don't want you guys like going out and doing drugs together and stuff like that. But like the reality is they would see each other at parties, and they would like see each other at football games, and all that kind of stuff. And I never really had a major issue with it. It never became inappropriate. What I did ask is that guys would disclose it, if they did, but literally in 5 years of doing it, I think I had one incident where all the guys like went to a party together. And actually, I think to be realistic, I think it built a relationship between them more.
Right. I think Yalom, the group guru, right? That was sort of more concerned about like alliances happening, like where people weren't gonna, because they were protecting each other. But it almost sounds like what you want is alliances. Like you want these guys to connect with each other, maybe because they are isolated in a way. So they're almost like the same guys we were working with. It's just that they, we had very strict rules about connecting outside of the group. You had to talk about it, of course, if it did. but we went over a bunch of scenarios, like what do you do in this scenario and that sort of thing. Looking back at it, I think we really followed more of the traditional YALM interpersonal process structure. What was your inspiration for this unique blend that you've come up with?
So originally, I took the model from San Jose State in terms of the game, because they're the one. San Jose State is the one who played poker. They did group. I didn't like that because I thought it was too distracting, right? If you're like playing a game while you're trying to talk, you're not paying attention to people. But I liked the idea of playing the game. So that was something I really wanted to keep. And so that just came up with like, also I had worked with a lot of teenagers, and we would go outside and like play, like hit a hockey puck back and forth to each other in North Dakota, or we would go outside and play catch. So the idea of like playing as like a form of relationship building was really important.
Right.
So I kind of combined those ideas. The what's going on in the world part kind of emerged just naturally because, college students are late for group all the time. Right? So you're constantly like, well, let's not get started yet. And then rather than just sitting there in dead silence, which I hate, like I would always just be like, hey, did anybody see the new Avengers? And then I noticed like people got really excited to talk about that with me because I'm like super nerdy and like know every little detail of these movies and stuff. And then all of a sudden like you start realizing like that's rapport building. And so eventually I just kind of like formalized it. And then it was like, year after year, I would have the best attendance at my groups of like, the counseling centers that I worked at. And there'd be 30 groups at Ohio State, and I would always be in the top 2 or 3. So it was like, okay, well, this is clearly working. And then the biggest thing is I took a page from Bruce Wampold and Scott Miller's book, was I would ask for tons and tons of feedback after every single group. Like when the 15 weeks would be up, I would dedicate almost 30 minutes of the last session specifically like, what did you guys like? What did you hate? What was the best part? What was the worst part? What things should we... So lots of stuff got cut into the the editing room floor, like as I went, and I would like experiment with things. And then like lots of stuff got elevated and optimized as time went on. So it was really like a feedback-driven approach.
Right. Well, that's really cool, man. How did this get on the radar of the Wall Street Journal?
So it actually came twice. So realistically, the Wall Street Journal wanted to do an article looking at men's mental health. So they started contacting different colleges, and they just look for major colleges. And it just so happened that they went to some of the Big Ten colleges. And so they wanted to know who was doing like good men's work. And then, we had this whole Movember campaign that I did, which is this men's mental health campaign. Yeah. And they were like, oh, okay, what do you do for that? And I was like, well, that's not all we do. And then it was like, we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this, we do this. And then they kind of picked out the things that they liked, which actually I wasn't really like, they picked out our broga, which was like yoga for men thing, which to be honest was one of our least, little insider scoop here, was actually one of our least effective events.
Well, that's interesting.
Well, it makes sense again. Like, let's go back to our model that I'm talking about. Yeah. It's like, how can we push men into something? Like, it would have been way more effective to do like a football game or something, rather than like, there were men who showed up, but they tended to already be into yoga, which eliminates the whole point, right?
Kip, this reminds me of something. Have you seen mantherapy.org? That's run out of Colorado State, I think it is.
No.
If you Google mantherapy.org, you get this guy named Dr. Rich Mahogany, who, like, it's funny, right?
Yeah.
He's like, it kind of reminds me of Ron Swanson's character from Parks and Rec. But the whole idea is to try to get guys to go to therapy. And I honestly feel like it's like too much. Like it's almost like so, like saying the word broga, instead of yoga. Like I think it's so like guys. I think most guys actually would be more embarrassed to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Than to like, you know what I mean? Like it almost signals that you have fragile masculinity, that you have to go here, rather than just go to like Psychology Today or something and find a therapist.
Yeah, and it goes against the whole stoicism thing. Right, being chill is the new stoicism, right?
Sure.
So if you're being like, yeah, hell yeah, bro, like you love therapy, man, like that's not chill, right? It has to be
more like I'm a man and I do man's therapy. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
exactly. Like that's not chill at all. That goes against the whole generation, right? So yeah, I mean that's kind of the group, and then I think in terms of the specific like interventions and stuff, 90% of it really was just telling guys you're proud of them in different ways,
Right.
and then like once in a when you really get relationship going good, then challenging guys in like very specific ways and
Right.
like saying things like there was times I would say to guys like, hey man, I expect more from you, like I expect better from you, like I know you can do this, why are you like holding yourself back, and being a little bit more challenging. But you really have to build that relationship before you can get there with those guys, because they really got to know you're in their corner. Now,
Right.
the one other thing that I would do, and this sounds kind of creepy the way I'm going to say it, but I'm going to say it the way I say it, which is like
Yeah.
we would very purposely groom leaders in the group. And we called these guys veterans in the group, even though they weren't literal veterans. Some of them literally were, I guess, veterans, but very few of them.
They
And
were
what I
experienced.
and what I would do is I would actually, after group, like the 15 weeks ended, if a guy was coming back, I would meet with that guy one-on-one if I kind of determined I thought he was going to be a leader. And I would basically say to him, like, hey man, like I was really impressed with you in group. I thought you were like exceptional in the group, and I want you to be like a leader. And it's your job to like help these other guys as they come in the group. And then like the guys like that because it's almost like they're getting a little promotion or something like that.
Right. Right. Well, not only that, I mean, if you think about it, what is the most therapeutic thing someone can do? It's to help others go through the same things they've gone through, right? I mean, well, it's not the most therapeutic, but it's pretty therapeutic to do that. So I think it's quite clever. So you're kind of stacking the deck in some ways to have guys in your corner. Like you said earlier, you can look at them and like automatically they'll know what to do. Do you ever bring them in terms of the theories and stuff, or just
nothing like that? No, not even a little bit. But they get it at a because they've been cultured to the group, so they kind of know what I expect, right? And the thing is like, and this is something that we don't do in therapy usually, but it's developing leadership skills for them,
right,
which is like every guy I think needs and is like really important, and leadership skills that tend to lean toward a healthy direction,
right,
not being like coercive or a dick or something. Like you're like trying to like be supportive and helpful, which then I'm hoping those leadership guys bring out into their communities. So I would have like people who are they were on the executive board of their fraternity, then I would love those guys, because what I would do then is I would like tap those guys, have them become leaders, and then I'm thinking, oh my god, these guys are going to go back to their fraternity and they're going to spread this like wealth, which I know some of them did, because some of them tried to even run little like men's groups in their fraternities.
That's
based
awesome,
on based on what we were doing.
That's
just
really
like get together and have time to talk kind of thing, because they really loved the group and they wanted to recreate that and spread the wealth. So that's why it's important to have like guys that are atypical in the group, because you can have that kind of profound impact that would like lend itself forward.
What do you mean atypical?
So guys that typically wouldn't attend therapy.
Oh, okay, that's what you mean. Yeah,
Like the fraternity, like same thing. Like let's say I got an athlete, right, and then he brings that healthy thing back to his team. All of a sudden, that whole team can get healthy. You know what I mean?
Not only that, you're taking the guys who have some relative status, if you will, and changing the culture of masculinity in that, making waves that way. In some ways, I mean, not necessarily explicitly in the sense of like, all the stuff that a lot of guys hear on college, which is don't be a rapist and all these things that men already know. It's more about how do you connect, how do you basically live your life as a human being, rather than being stuck in this man box, even though they're not even seeing it that way. That's what you're doing, man. You're helping guys connect, and I think that's beautiful and brilliant. You're doing it in kind of a covert way too. One thing I think about is it's so like oriented toward giving men these things that they so desperately need, but they're things that we know that men are socialized not to reach out and do with each other, not to really connect at a deeper level. Right. So, but women, on the other hand, are socialized in these things, or at least they don't have the same restrictions that men do. Would this work with women? And can women run this group?
I think so 2 questions there. I think it could work for some women. I think the model lends itself really well to men. I'm not saying women. I've never tried it with women, so
Right.
I don't necessarily know. I think it's a really good group model, period.
I think so too. Yeah.
I think I would want to modify slight parts, test them, and get feedback. Like for example, I don't know how well women would want to play spoons and like wrestle each other for a spoon. Like that feels very masculine to me. But maybe, So I mean, that would be something that
maybe part of the therapeutic piece is that men are connecting in a way that's consistent with their gender role, but then they're also breaking the gender role earlier. So it's sort of like giving them a chance to the precarious manhood paradigm, like show that they're get their man points back again. Yep. So maybe for women it would be the same thing. Like they're sticking with their gender role for one part of it, and they're breaking another part. It's just kind of turned around. Right. So that women doing some kind of competitive sport would be maybe breaking some of that. I don't know, maybe not.
And I, like I said, like I come into all this stuff with a very curious, like empirically driven mind. Like I come in like, did this work? Didn't it work? And then like also not just letting one group dictate what's been working and what's been not working. Because I've had it where I've had 5 or 6 groups say they love something, and all of a sudden I get one group that's like, oh, you shouldn't do that. And I'm like, okay, but I've had 5 that said to do it, right? So I
what's
know
the trend, right?
Right. So the trend, not just the singular piece. Now the other thing is like I have co-facilitated the group with women. I've also co-facilitated the group with LGBT identified men as well. I've co-facilitated the group with trans men as well. So I've done it with a lot of different types of people, and I think it definitely, absolutely can work with no matter what. But again, like it's about cultural competence, right? Because what I always found is that the people who held those identities were way too focused on their own identity and not focused on like the group itself. So they would be thinking, let's say I had like a woman, for example, running the group. I had women who would be very focused on like, oh, do you think they're censoring themselves because of me? And I would tell them like, no, I don't really think they were. Because I've listened to these guys talk for 1,000 hours at this point, so I kind of know what's talked about. But I think there was almost this perception that in men's group, all we talk about is getting laid and masturbation and all this stuff. But in actuality, that's
and farting and scratching
and because they didn't necessarily see that happening, there was this assumption that things were being censored for them, or they would want to have these deep dialogues about like, oh, let's talk about my identity. And I would shy away from that. I would say like, okay, maybe hit it like once and then get back to focusing on them. Because if you're like, we have 12 guys in the room, 13 if you count me, right? And then there's 13 people now focusing on your gender identity and having a conversation about it.
Right.
Like, we're no longer doing the work that the guys are there to do. Now, if there was a time where I did feel like something gender related was coming up, I would bring that up. But it was my experience that if they handled it in a way that was culturally competent with men versus handling it from this like kind of identity perspective, the culturally competent with men perspective would be way more effective, right, than like coming at it from like a gender perspective or something. So for example, I remember one of the most beautiful moments with one of my female supervisees is somebody had been giving somebody shit, and like somebody gave her shit, like just because she was like so in the group or whatever, and she like fired it right back at them, and then they said a hilarious like one-liner, and it was like everybody in the group was like, oh damn, like got him, and it was like such a good moment because I told her that like in supervision that day, I was like, you just did like great therapy work, because that joke you made landed so well. Right. Like that moment, I told her your gender was invisible.
Right. Well, man, this has been really cool. I wonder if there's anything else that you want to talk about related to it.
I would say, it's just like an important thing to do and like try to get going in different places. I think it can be really healthy. I think the biggest thing is like this was just the model that worked for me and works for my personality, and I think it would work different for different people's personality. But I would say the number one thing is that empirically testing part, which is like try something out, be creative, be innovative, and like don't be so attached to it because you think it's cool or you think it's like like interesting, or like is like fits what you want to do or something like that. Like be able to be willing to throw anything away and keep anything. And I would say keep it dynamic. That's the other thing. Like I used to have a rule with my supervisees: we will have no long pauses unless it's a really deep, important moment. Like what we will never do is start group like, okay, guys, so who wants to talk? Dead silence.
Yeah.
Like that is group killing in men's groups. And to be honest, I think group killing in any group. I just think people are not.
It sure can be. Yeah.
Right. So don't do that kind of stuff, and don't try to crowbar masculinity. Embrace it, like treat it as a cultural identity. Like embrace it and think it, like make it important, make it seem important to you, and groups will run themselves.
Right. I think implicit in that, what I'm also hearing is if you do those things, you'll reach the guys who may not go to therapy.
Yeah.
The more traditional guys, let's say, for lack of a better term, or at least the guys that are just not, they're not like you said, they're your atypical guys. They're not coming in for therapy. And I think that's really important, because what's the point of preaching to the choir? You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
We're gonna change the culture of men. And I have said, and it got me in trouble on Fox News, but I'll say it again: we changed men, man. We changed the world.
Yeah.
That's got to start with the men that serve in these kind of more status positions sometimes, or at least guys that are less likely to do these sort of things, because they're the ones that sometimes other guys look up to.
Or how about this, Ryan, for like a modification of your quote? If we let men express themselves directly, we can change the world, right? Because not really. It's like your example you gave about your guy who's like, I just wanted everybody to like me. That's because he tried to funnel it through something else, right? And if he just went straight ahead, everybody can connect with that.
That's great. Yeah, and there's a lot of research suggests that it's the emotional restriction aspects of masculine roles that are the most damaging. So I think that what your group is doing is letting guys maybe connect with their emotions. So I've got one last question for you. What does happen if somebody's having a deep moment in therapy, like a crying moment?
So one thing I really do in that moment is I make a couple of different determinations. One is, what's the humiliation factor in that moment? Like, is this guy feeling embarrassed? What's the status of the group? What's the energy in the room? What's the feel in the room? I'm paying attention to that. If that guy is like everyone else is in one direction and that guy's by himself, I may actually intervene and like switch the attention off that and not even acknowledge the crying, right? Other times, if the energy is right and I'm feeling it's a good moment, I'll actually bring that guy into the group, like praise his like bravery around being able to open up like that, and then I'm going to go somewhere where I think that like whatever he's being upset about, I'm going to put that into somebody else's world, right? So I'm going to, like, let's say he's upset about a breakup, right? I know, because I have a good memory in the group, I know other guys who have been through breakups, and I'm going to connect to that guy directly to somebody else to make sure that bridge happens between him and another person. And then usually if you can get 2 or 3 guys into that, then the whole energy of the group is very supportive, right? One thing I never did is I never had a tissue box sitting in the middle of my group.
Right. No, we ever did that either, actually. We would always take it out before our group is called the men's room. We would always make sure that it was sort of like the chairs were arranged and sort of like so we actually used beanbags, I think, for that group. So
Right. So, and the other thing is, it's all about helping that guy maintain his dignity. So even at the end of the group, I'm going to go back and I'll be like, I'm really proud of this guy today. He like really did a lot of work. And I'll say it like that. What I'm not going to say is like, oh, he was really vulnerable today and I appreciated it. I'm like, that guy did a lot of work today. And like other people should be trying to get to that level.
Yeah. Well, man, this has been very insightful for me. I haven't run a men's group in a long time, but I maybe want to start them again. I'm going to be looking at different options for our groups, but these would be internal therapy clients. We don't have the same resources that you had at Ohio, but I think hopefully people watch this video and get an idea of like maybe what they could do. Especially, I would argue this kind of group is not taught in PhD programs, and particularly related to men's issues. I mean, we don't get a lot of training in men's issues anyway, but this is just another way we could apply it. So that's it. What do we get right? what do we get wrong? Please let us know in the comments, and we look forward to hearing from you. And so this has been Dr. Ryon McDermott, and
Dr. Kipp Pietrantonio.
all right, we're out.
Adios.